The night my family erased me didn't begin with shouting. It began with a birthday cake, polite laughter, and a room full of people who shared my last name, until the lights suddenly went out, and a projector flickered on, freezing an old photo of me, sitting across from my sister's husband in a cafe 7 years earlier. And before I could speak, my sister stood up and called me the woman who destroyed her marriage. While my parents didn't ask a single question, my father told me to leave, and my mother looked at me like I was already a stranger. I didn't know then that the accusation had been staged, that recordings existed, that emails had been buried, or that 7 years later the same sister would be exposed and dragged out of that house the exact way I had been, after the truth finally played out loud. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about what happens when lies survive longer than love, and what it costs to stop running from them. So if you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you want to hear how this really ends, you're welcome to stay with me and subscribe. They gave me 1 hour. That was all. 60 minutes to stop being a daughter and turn into a problem that needed to be removed. My father stood in the doorway of my childhood bedroom while I packed. His arms crossed, his face set in that familiar expression he used when a decision had already been made and discussion was no longer welcome. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The calm in his tone made it clear this wasn't an argument. It was an eviction. My mother hovered behind him, adjusting the collar of her sweater, straightening a stack of magazines that didn't need straightening. She didn't look at me while I folded my clothes into a suitcase that still had a baggage tag from my last work trip hanging off the handle. That detail stayed with me the way my adult life and my exile collided in the same object. I remember thinking distantly that I hadn't even unpacked properly after that trip. I'd assumed I was coming home. When I tried to speak to say my sister was lying, my father cut me off with a short, sharp motion of his hand. "Enough," he said. "You've done enough." Then he tossed my house keys onto the bed like they were contaminated. "From now on, don't call us Mom and Dad," he added. "You made your choices." I didn't know what choices he was talking about. I still don't. I introduced Noah to my sister years ago because he was a nutritionist, and she'd asked if I knew anyone who could help with her migraines. That was the extent of my involvement. But facts didn't matter in that room. The story had already been written, and I had been cast as the villain. When the hour was up, my suitcase was half full and my hands were shaking. My mother finally looked at me, then her eyes glossy but hard. "If you come back," she said quietly, "I'll call the police." She said it the way someone recites a rule, not a threat. Like she'd already rehearsed it. I walked out of the house without looking back. The door closed behind me with a sound that felt final in a way I didn't yet understand. Outside, Gastown looked the same as it always had: brick sidewalks slick with rain, street lamps glowing softly through the mist, tourists ducking into cafes to escape the weather. It felt obscene that the world hadn't paused. I sat down on the curb with my suitcase beside me, the rain soaking through my coat, and stared at my phone like it might explain what had just happened. One by one, the messages failed to send. My sister, blocked. My mother, blocked. My father, blocked. Even my aunt, who'd hugged me earlier that night, was suddenly unreachable. It was as if someone had flipped a switch and erased me from the system. The last message that came through was from my mother, sent just before she blocked me. "Do not contact us again," it read. "If you show up, I will involve the authorities." There was no signature. No "Love, Mom," just instructions. I sat there until my fingers went numb, replaying the night in my head, looking for the moment I could have fixed it. That reflex to assume responsibility for other people's decisions wasn't new. It had been trained into me over years of being the extra child, the one who arrived after my parents thought they were finished. Bianca used to joke about it openly. "You were the accident," she'd say, laughing like it was a charming family anecdote instead of something that settled into my bones. She was always the one they protected, the one whose emotions dictated the weather in the house. If Bianca was upset, plans changed. Voices softened. Explanations were offered. When I was upset, I was told to be understanding, to be patient, to not make things harder than they needed to be. Sitting on that curb, I realized how quickly those old dynamics had snapped back into place. Bianca accused. They believed. I was removed. I tried to call Noah then, not because I thought he could fix anything, but because I needed someone who knew the truth to say it out loud. The call went straight to voicemail. I sent a text. No response. Later, I would learn he'd moved apartments, changed his number, and cut contact with everyone connected to that period of his life. At the time, all I knew was that the last neutral witness had vanished. By midnight, the rain had soaked through my shoes. I dragged my suitcase to a cheap hotel a few blocks away, paid for one night with a credit card. I wasn't sure I'd be able to keep paying off, and lay awake staring at the ceiling. Every few minutes, my phone buzzed with nothing phantom vibrations, my body still expecting contact that wasn't coming. I kept thinking about how fast it had happened. One accusation, one projection on a wall, and suddenly my entire history with my family was rewritten. I wasn't a daughter who'd tried to help. I was a traitor, a liability, someone whose presence threatened their image. By morning, the shock had settled into something heavier, not panic, not anger. Just a dull understanding that whatever I'd lost that night, I wasn't getting it back by explaining myself. I could keep knocking on a door that had been locked from the inside, or I could stop knocking altogether. I chose silence. Not because it was brave, but because I didn't have the strength to beg people who had already decided I was disposable. I left Vancouver within the week. New job, new apartment, new routines that didn't include waiting for my phone to ring. What I didn't know then was that the lie would live comfortably in that house for 7 years, and that one day it would collapse under the weight of its own recordings. I didn't plan to look for anyone from that time. For years, I treated the past like a sealed room, something that could exist as long as I didn't open the door. But silence has a way of thinning out, and once it does, questions start slipping through. They didn't arrive all at once. They came slowly in quiet moments when nothing else was loud enough to distract me. Sienna's name was one of the first that surfaced. Bianca had mentioned her often during the divorce, always with the same dismissive tone. A gym friend. A bad influence. Someone who, according to Bianca, had crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. At the time, I'd accepted those descriptions without thinking too deeply about them. I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to interrogate every detail. I was too busy surviving my own removal. But years later, with distance between me and that night, Sienna became something else in my mind. Not a villain, a variable. I found her online easily enough. Her profile was public. Her life laid out in fragments, work events, hiking photos, a dog she seemed devoted to. Nothing about it suggested the chaos Bianca had once described. That should have been my first clue. I hesitated for days before reaching out. Part of me worried I was reopening wounds that weren't mine to touch. Another part was afraid she'd confirm everything I'd been accused of helping to create. But curiosity, once it settles in, doesn't stay polite. It demands resolution. She responded within an hour. We met at a cafe halfway between our offices, neutral ground neither of us could claim. She looked older than I remembered, but calmer too, less defensive. When she saw me, her expression tightened, not with anger, but recognition. Like she'd been waiting for this conversation without knowing it. I always wondered if you'd reach out, she said after we ordered. There was no accusation in her voice, just something tired. I didn't know where to start, so I didn't try to control the conversation. I told her I'd been cut off, that I'd been blamed, that I'd spent years not knowing which parts of the story were real. I watched her face closely as I spoke, looking for hesitation, for guilt. It never came. I never slept with Noah, she said quietly before I could even ask. Not once. She didn't rush the explanation. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through old messages, work schedules, meal plans, follow-ups from training sessions. The kind of communication that leaves a paper trail because there's nothing to hide. She handed the phone to me without ceremony. Bianca accused me too, she added. She told people I was obsessed with him, that I was trying to replace her. I looked at the dates, the timestamps, the language. It was all professional. Boring even. Exactly the opposite of the story I'd been handed. Sienna took a breath like she'd been holding it for years. She messaged me, she said. Told me to disappear from Noah's life. Said I was causing problems I didn't understand. That was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically. There was no rush of clarity, no cinematic click into place. Just a quiet adjustment like a shelf settling after being nudged. Bianca hadn't just accused. She'd managed, controlled, directed the narrative from behind the scenes. I asked Sienna why she hadn't spoken up sooner. She gave a small, humorless smile. Who was going to listen? She said. She had your parents. She had the story. And I was just convenient. Convenient. The word lingered. When we left the cafe, I didn't feel relieved. I felt exposed. The possibility that I'd been positioned intentionally, not accidentally, as the scapegoat made the past feel heavier, not lighter. It meant the damage wasn't collateral. It was planned. Still, I didn't have proof. Only impressions. Only another person's truth layered against my own. I wasn't ready to take that back to anyone, least of all my family. They had shown me what happened when I spoke without evidence. So I did what I'd learned to do best. I disappeared further. I moved cities, changed jobs, built routines that didn't depend on approval or explanation. I became efficient at detachment, skilled at leaving things unsaid. People in my life knew me as composed, capable, reliable. They didn't know the silence had been rehearsed. Every so often, I thought about confronting Bianca. Imagined what I'd say if I saw her again. But those thoughts always ended the same way, with me standing alone, speaking into a room that had already decided what I was. 7 years passed like that. Not empty, but contained. I told myself that was enough. That truth didn't need witnesses to exist. That my version of events could stay internal without consequence. I was wrong, because lies don't stay isolated. They expand. They demand maintenance. And eventually, they require someone else to carry them. When the first anonymous email arrived years later, I recognized the tone before I recognized the name. It wasn't angry. It wasn't apologetic. It was precise. Controlled. Like someone finally deciding to stop protecting a structure that had already started to rot. And for the first time since that night in Gastown, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that silence hadn't ended the story. It had only delayed it. By the time my life settled into something that resembled stability, I had learned how to keep the past compartmentalized. It lived in a quiet corner of my mind, rarely touched, never examined too closely. I told myself that was growth. That moving forward meant not looking back unless absolutely necessary. On paper, I was doing well. I had worked my way into a brand management role that demanded precision and restraint skills I'd developed long before I knew they had professional value. My days were structured, predictable. I knew how to anticipate problems before they surfaced, how to smooth rough edges without drawing attention to myself. People trusted me. They relied on me. And for the first time, that reliance didn't come with emotional conditions attached. Julian entered my life without urgency. He didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. He didn't push for explanations or perform concern when silence was easier. He noticed details: how I flinched when my phone rang unexpectedly, how I preferred sitting where I could see exits, how I double-checked doors even in familiar places. He never tried to fix those things. He adjusted around them. When he proposed, it wasn't elaborate, no audience, no spectacle. just a quiet certainty that surprised me more than any grand gesture could have. I said yes without hesitation, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe I was done being defined by what I'd lost. The photo Julian posted afterward was simple. The two of us smiling in a way that wasn't performative, my hand lifted just enough for the ring to catch the light. Friends commented. Colleagues sent messages. It felt like a milestone I'd earned without having to bleed for it. 3 days later, the email arrived. It didn't come with a subject line. Just my name in the preview spelled correctly the way only people who'd known me for a long time ever bothered to do. I almost deleted it. Years of conditioning had taught me that messages without context rarely brought anything worth opening. But curiosity has a way of bypassing caution. Aria, the email began. Your sister is not who you think she is. You deserve to know what really happened. There was no signature, no explanation, just an attachment. My hands were steady when I clicked it. That surprised me. I'd expected a physical reaction, nausea, panic, something dramatic. Instead, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the kind that comes when something unresolved finally shifts its weight. The attachment wasn't a confession. It was a screenshot. An old email exchange dated years back. Bianca's name sat at the top of the thread, unmistakable. The language was calculated indirect, the kind of phrasing that implies rather than states. She talked about protecting appearances, about making sure the right story survives, about consequences if things didn't stay contained. The sender address at the bottom stopped my breath. Noah Blake. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, reading the lines again and again, searching for inconsistencies. But the timestamps matched the timeline I'd been trying not to revisit. The wording echoed things Bianca had said out loud, only stripped of the emotional performance she'd perfected in public. Another email followed minutes later. I should have sent this years ago, it read. I didn't. That was cowardice. I won't ask you to forgive me. I'm only asking you to see what I didn't stop. Attached were more files, conversations, notes, a pattern forming slowly, deliberately. Not a single explosive revelation, but something worse, a sustained effort to shape perception while redirecting blame. I closed my laptop and sat in the quiet of our living room, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic. Julian wasn't home yet. I was grateful for that. I needed the space to let the past re-enter on my own terms. 7 years earlier, I'd been told to leave without explanation. Now explanations were lining up uninvited. What unsettled me most wasn't the content of the emails. It was the restraint. Bianca hadn't lashed out blindly. She'd curated the narrative with care, adjusting details just enough to maintain plausibility. She'd known exactly which buttons to press, which silences to exploit. And my parents, eager for resolution for a version of events that preserved their sense of order, had accepted it without resistance. I thought about the projector, the timing, the confidence with which she'd stood up that night and spoken. It hadn't been impulsive. It had been rehearsed. When Julian came home, he found me still sitting there, the laptop closed but not forgotten. I didn't hand him the files right away. I told him only that someone from my past had reached out and that it wasn't nothing. He didn't push. He sat beside me close enough to be present, far enough to give me control. Later that night, when I did show him the emails, he read them slowly, carefully. When he finished, he didn't say what I expected. He didn't ask what I planned to do. He just said, "You didn't imagine any of it." That landed heavier than anything else. For years, I'd told myself that closure was optional, that I could build a life without resolving the injustice at its foundation. But staring at Bianca's words preserved in black and white, I understood something I hadn't before. Silence had protected everyone except me. And now that the truth had found its way back, it wasn't asking permission. It was asking what I intended to do with it. I didn't respond to Noah right away. Not because I didn't want answers, but because I needed to understand what kind of answers I was about to receive. There's a difference between curiosity and consent, and once you open certain doors, you don't get to decide how wide they swing. It was Noah who followed up 2 days later. His message was short. No greetings, no apologies disguised as politeness. Just a sentence that carried more weight than it should have. There are recordings. That was when I agreed to meet him. We chose a quiet place, neutral, forgettable, the kind of cafe designed for people who didn't want to be seen. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. Not because he'd changed dramatically, but because time had stripped away the version of him I remembered. He looked older, thinner, more deliberate in his movements, like someone who'd learned to live carefully. He didn't reach across the table, didn't try to ease the tension. He opened his laptop and turned it toward me. "I should have stopped this," he said. I didn't. The first thing he showed me wasn't audio. It was an email thread I hadn't seen before. Bianca again. Her tone was different here, less performative, more transactional. She talked about timing, about leverage, about how fear worked better than anger if you used it correctly. She referenced a pregnancy she hadn't confirmed medically, yet asked questions about how long she could delay tests without raising suspicion. My stomach tightened. Noah didn't rush me. He waited until I finished reading before he spoke again. "She wasn't pregnant," he said. "She told me she was. Then she told me she'd lost it. Later I found out there was never a doctor. Never a record." He clicked another file open. This time it was audio. Bianca's voice filled the space between us, clear, unfiltered, stripped of the softness she used in front of our parents. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pleading. She was calculating. Talking about how she could make the story stick. How she could redirect suspicion. How people believed what they were shown, not what they were told. Then my name came up. "She'll take the fall," Bianca said. "She always does. They never question her." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not shock, not disbelief, but recognition. That sentence didn't introduce a new idea. It confirmed an old one. Noah paused the recording. "That was the night everything turned," he said. "When I realized she'd already decided who was going to be blamed." He explained the rest slowly, methodically. The affair with Ronan, the gym trainer. Being caught. The confrontation. Bianca's immediate pivot from panic to strategy. When my name entered the equation, it wasn't out of desperation. It was convenience. I was the variable that could absorb impact without pushing back. "She told your parents first," Noah said. By the time I tried to explain, they weren't listening. I thought about my father's voice that night. The certainty. The refusal to engage. I had mistaken it for anger. Now I understood it was alignment. Noah admitted his part without embellishment. He hadn't fought hard enough. He hadn't gone public with the recordings. He'd been tired, ashamed, eager to close the chapter and move on. Letting the lie stand had been easier than dragging it into daylight. "I told myself it wasn't my responsibility anymore," he said. I was wrong. I listened without interrupting. There was no satisfaction in hearing his regret. Only a heavy awareness of how many people had found silence more comfortable than truth, and how often I had been the cost of that comfort. By the time we left the cafe, the narrative I'd lived under for 7 years had fully collapsed. Not in a dramatic explosion, but in a slow, irreversible dismantling. Every doubt I'd buried had found its answer. Every self-blame I'd carried now had a name, and it wasn't mine. On the walk home, I replayed Bianca's voice in my head. Not the accusation from the projector screen, but the one from the recording. Calm, strategic, certain of her parents' loyalty, certain of my disposability. That certainty had protected her for years, but it also revealed her weakness. Bianca didn't just lie. She depended on the lie being unquestioned. Her life, her financial support, Her standing in the family, all of it rested on my silence, and my parents' refusal to look too closely. When I told Julian everything that night, I expected anger on my behalf. What I got instead was something steadier. He listened. He asked clarifying questions. He didn't rush to conclusions or suggest what I should do next. When I finished, he said, "Whatever you decide, you're not doing it to prove anything. You're doing it because you're done carrying this alone." That distinction mattered. For the first time since that night in Gastown, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't defending myself against a story already told. I was choosing whether to speak, knowing exactly what my words would dismantle. I thought about my parents, about the money they'd funneled to Bianca without question, about the heirlooms that had gone missing, the explanations that never quite lined up. I thought about how much of their trust had been built on the assumption that I would stay quiet. I realized then that confronting the truth wouldn't just expose Bianca. It would force my parents to confront themselves. And that was something none of us had ever done. By the time I fell asleep, the decision had already formed, not as anger, not as revenge, but as a refusal to disappear again. This time, I wasn't going to run. I didn't tell myself I was forming an alliance. That word implies intention fueled by anger, by strategy sharpened into something theatrical. What Noah and I shared wasn't that. It was quieter. He had evidence, I had context, and between us sat 7 years of a lie that had been allowed to breathe too freely. We met again a week later, this time not in public. He invited me to his apartment, a place that felt temporary, like he hadn't committed to staying anywhere for long. The furniture was sparse. Boxes lined one wall, half unpacked, half abandoned. It matched the way he spoke about his life, functional, contained, deliberately unfinished. "I'm not asking you to do anything," he said as he set his laptop on the table between us. "I just didn't want to be the only one holding this anymore." That honesty mattered more than I expected. It shifted the dynamic. This wasn't him handing responsibility back to me. It was him acknowledging the weight he'd carried and dropped years ago. We went through everything together. The recordings, the emails, the timeline. We didn't dramatize it. We verified, cross-checked dates. Not because we doubted the truth, but because truth, if it was going to surface, needed to be precise. Bianca's power had always come from narrative control. If we were going to disrupt that, we couldn't afford emotional shortcuts. Patterns emerged quickly. Bianca had been living almost entirely off my parents since the divorce. Rent, credit cards, cash transfers labeled as emergency support. There was always a reason, a justification, a story that painted her as fragile, unlucky, perpetually recovering from something. My parents had stepped in automatically the way they always had. Protect first, ask later. And they never asked me. What struck me wasn't just the favoritism. It was the assumption embedded in it that I would endure, that I would absorb discomfort quietly, that I wouldn't contest the version of events that kept their world orderly. She knows how to play them. Noah said, scrolling through bank statements he'd managed to obtain during the divorce proceedings. She always has. I thought about the night I'd been told to leave, how quickly my father had moved, how final it had felt. I'd interpreted it as rage. Now I saw it differently. It had been efficiency, removing the variable that complicated Bianca's story. For years, I'd blamed myself for not fighting harder, for not demanding evidence, for leaving without making them hear me. Sitting there looking at the paper trail Bianca had left behind, I understood how little room there had been for me to win that fight. "She survives by staying central," I said slowly. "If she loses their trust, she loses everything." Noah nodded. "That's why I stayed quiet," he admitted. "I didn't want to be the one to push her off that edge." There was no judgment in his voice, just regret. We didn't talk about revenge. We talked about exposure, about letting facts exist where they'd been deliberately hidden. about what would happen if my parents were forced to confront evidence instead of emotion. I felt something settle inside me as we spoke. Not satisfaction, not anticipation, but resolve. This wasn't about correcting the past. That had already happened. I'd lost 7 years regardless of what came next. This was about deciding whether the future would be built on the same silence. Julian was the first person I told about the plan, if it could be called that. I laid it out plainly, that I intended to go back. That I wasn't going to ask for forgiveness or offer explanations framed to soften the truth. That I would present what I had and let it stand. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked one question. What happens if they still choose her? I considered that carefully. It was the question that had kept me quiet for years. The risk that truth wouldn't be enough. Then nothing changes, I said. Except I won't be wondering anymore. That answer surprised me. It felt complete. The days leading up to our return were quiet, almost calm. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't imagine confrontations. I focused on logistics, on timing, on making sure the evidence was accessible and unaltered. Control, I'd learned, came from preparation, not volume. Noah and I agreed to go together. Not as a show of unity, but because his presence mattered. He was the one my parents had never truly heard from. The one whose silence had allowed Bianca's version to settle as fact. We didn't call ahead. When we arrived at my parents' house, nothing looked different. The same neutral exterior, the same trimmed hedges. Stability curated. It struck me how convincing that illusion had always been, even when things inside were rotting. My father answered the door. His expression shifted the moment he saw me, not anger, not relief, but calculation. He noticed Noah immediately. The tension landed before a word was spoken. "This isn't a good time," he said. "I know," I replied. "That's why we're here." He started to close the door. Noah stepped forward, not aggressively, just enough to prevent it. The movement was small, but the implication wasn't. This conversation wasn't optional. Inside, Bianca's voice carried from the living room. She was laughing. Comfortable. At ease in a space she believed was unassailable. I felt no rush of emotion then. No fear. No adrenaline. Just a steady awareness that I wasn't the person who'd been forced out 7 years ago. This time, I hadn't come to plead. I had come to place the truth where it could no longer be ignored. The living room smelled the same as it always had: polished wood, faint citrus cleaner. Something warm in the air from the kitchen that suggested comfort without ever quite delivering it. Bianca was sitting on the couch when we walked in, her legs tucked under her phone in hand, mid-laugh. She looked up, and for a brief second her expression didn't register surprise. It registered calculation. My father stepped in front of us instinctively, his body angled like a barrier. "You need to leave," he said, already reaching for his phone. "I'm calling the police." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rush. I placed my phone on the coffee table between us, screened down, a deliberate movement that made everyone pause. "Before you do," I said, "you should listen to something." Bianca scoffed. "This again," she said lightly, like I was a nuisance she'd dealt with before. "You really can't let things go, can you?" Noah didn't respond to her. He pulled a folder from his bag and set it beside my phone. Thick. Organized. The kind of physical weight that makes denial harder to maintain. "I'm not here to argue," he said. "I'm here to correct the record." My mother had come in from the kitchen, a dish towel still in her hands. She froze when she saw us, her eyes flicking from my face to Noah's, then to the folder. I watched her posture shift, not defensive yet, but uncertain. That was new. I tapped my phone and the recording began. Bianca's voice filled the room, unmistakable. Calm. Measured. Talking about leverage, about how long she could delay seeing a doctor, about how fear worked better if you aimed it correctly. And then, my name. "She'll take the fall," Bianca's recorded voice said. She always does. They never question her. The sound seemed to stretch the room, pulling the walls farther apart. My father's hand lowered slowly from where it had hovered near his phone. My mother's grip on the towel loosened until it slipped to the floor. Bianca stood up abruptly. "That's taken out of context," she said, her voice sharper now. "You don't know what he manipulated." Noah interrupted her, not loudly but firmly. "There's more." He opened the folder and slid out the divorce documents, turning them so my parents could see. Dates, statements, financial disclosures. Then finally, the pawn receipt. I picked it up and placed it on the table myself. "This," I said, "is the jade bracelet Grandma left to me. The one that went missing after I moved out." My mother stared at the paper, then at Bianca. "You said it was lost," she whispered. Bianca's face drained of color. "I needed money," she said quickly. "I was desperate. You know how things were after the divorce. You didn't ask," my mother said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a realization. The room felt different then. Less controlled. Like a structure that had relied on careful balance was finally leaning too far to one side. My father sank into the armchair, his movements slow, deliberate. "Is any of this untrue?" he asked Bianca. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice broke not into tears but into something rawer. "I was scared," she said. "I thought if I lost you, I'd have nothing." "You already had everything," my father said quietly. No one spoke for a long moment. The recording had ended, but its presence lingered, filling the spaces where excuses used to live. Then my father stood. "Pack a bag," he said to Bianca. "You're leaving." Her head snapped up. "What now?" he repeated. "Before I say something I can't take back." She looked at me, then really looked at me, and for the first time I didn't see superiority or dismissal. I saw panic. "Arya," she said, her voice cracking. "Please. Tell him." I met her gaze evenly. "Did you tell them to stop when I was forced out?" I asked. She opened her mouth, closed it again. The symmetry of the moment wasn't lost on me. 7 years ago, I had stood in this same room with a suitcase, my worth reduced to a narrative I hadn't authored. Now Bianca stood where I once had, watching the same door become a boundary instead of an entrance. My father handed her a duffel bag from the hall closet. "Go," he said. She left without another word. After the door closed, the silence felt heavier than any shouting ever could have. My mother sat down slowly, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the space Bianca had occupied. "I didn't know," she said finally. I nodded. "That's the problem," I replied. Noah gathered his things quietly. He didn't look triumphant. He looked relieved. As we stood to leave, my father spoke again. "We need to talk," he said. "All of us." I considered that. The instinct to comply, to stay, to explain, to repair rose up automatically. Then it receded. "Not today," I said. "I've said everything I came to say." Outside, the air felt colder, sharper. I breathed it in deeply, aware that something irreversible had just happened. Not because Bianca had been exposed, but because I had chosen not to soften the truth to make it survivable for anyone else. For the first time, I walked away from that house without being pushed. Bianca didn't disappear after that night. She unraveled. At first, it happened quietly, in ways only people who had lived off structure and permission ever notice. Her phone calls to my parents went unanswered. The credit card she'd been using was declined. The rent payment she assumed would clear didn't. Stability, once automatic, became conditional, and she had no idea how to navigate that shift. My parents didn't tell me these things directly. I learned them in fragments through strained messages that avoided responsibility while circling discomfort. My mother would text late at night, asking vague questions about how I was doing, how work was going, whether I was still upset. My father sent a single message, clipped and formal, suggesting we talk soon. No apology, no acknowledgement, Just an attempt to move forward without addressing what had been unearthed. Bianca, on the other hand, made no attempt at subtlety. She called, repeatedly. Left voicemails that shifted in tone from indignation to despair in the span of minutes. In some, she framed herself as the victim of overreaction, insisting that what she'd done had been driven by fear, not malice. In others, she cried openly, talking about how lost she felt, how unfair it was that everything had collapsed so quickly. I listened to none of them all the way through. What surprised me most was not her desperation, but her confusion. She didn't seem to understand why exposure had consequences. As if the truth was an abstract concept, something that could exist without disrupting the hierarchy it challenged. When I finally answered one of her calls, it was by accident. Her voice rushed through the line before I could speak. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "You could have handled it privately." I waited. Let the silence do its work. "I've been struggling," she continued. "I don't have anyone. You know how they are. They don't know how to support me the way you do." That landed harder than any insult could have. "I supported you by disappearing," I said evenly, "by carrying something that wasn't mine for 7 years." She faltered. "I didn't ask you to. You counted on it," I interrupted. "There's a difference?" She cried then. Real tears, I think. Or at least convincing ones. But they didn't reach me. I had already grieved the version of her who might have mattered. "I just need time," she said. "Things will calm down." I ended the call without responding. Not long after, my parents reached out together. A joint message carefully worded. They said they were processing, that they had been misled, that they hoped we could rebuild. They didn't use the word sorry. Julian read the message over my shoulder and let out a short, incredulous laugh. "They're bold," he said. "I'll give them that." What struck me wasn't the audacity. It was the expectation. They assumed access had been restored simply because Bianca's credibility had collapsed. As if truth was a reset button, not a reckoning. I didn't respond. Days passed. Then weeks. Bianca tried again, this time in person. I was leaving work when I saw her across the street standing near my car. She looked smaller somehow, less curated. Her hair was pulled back hastily, her clothes wrinkled. She waved when she saw me, relief flooding her face as if my presence alone had stabilized something. I froze. She crossed the street quickly, too quickly, positioning herself in front of my car before I could unlock it. "Please," she said. "Just 5 minutes." I said nothing. "I know I messed up," she continued. "But I'm still your sister." The word sister felt foreign in her mouth. Stripped of entitlement, it sounded almost desperate. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said. "They won't let me stay." "I can't afford." I held up my hand. "Move," I said. She didn't. Instead, she placed both palms flat against the hood of my car and leaned forward, her voice dropping into something raw and unsteady. "If you leave," she said, "I'll kill myself." Time slowed in a way I hadn't experienced before. Not panic, not fear, just clarity. I stepped back and took out my phone. "What are you doing?" she asked, her eyes widening. "I'm calling the police," I said calmly. "You're threatening self-harm and blocking my vehicle." Her expression shifted instantly from desperation to disbelief. "You wouldn't," she said. "I did." When the officers arrived, Bianca was still there, still crying, still insisting she just needed her family back. They spoke to her quietly, then asked her to step aside. She resisted, raised her voice, accused me of cruelty. They arrested her for harassment. My parents bailed her out that night. The message from my mother came hours later. "This is too far," she wrote. "You didn't have to involve law enforcement." I stared at the screen for a long time before responding. "No," I typed. I didn't have to let her control me again. That was the last message I sent to any of them. I blocked every number, every email, every account. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was clean. Weeks later, sitting in our living room, Julian asked me how I felt. I thought about it carefully. Like I finally stopped negotiating my worth, I said. Family, I'd learned, wasn't defined by blood or history or shared last names. It was defined by behavior. By who treated you like a person instead of a role. I didn't lose a family that year. I walked away from one that had already decided I was expendable. The quiet that followed wasn't immediate. It arrived in layers like dust settling after something heavy collapses. For a while, my phone stayed busy with attempts to reach me through new numbers, borrowed accounts, messages sent at odd hours meant to catch me off guard. I didn't open them. I didn't need to. The pattern was already familiar, pressure disguised as concern, urgency framed as love. Bianca tried first, then my parents. Not together, not coordinated, but always circling the same point. They wanted access without accountability, contact without consequence. My father's message was the most restrained. "We need to talk like adults," he wrote. What happened went too far. There was no mention of the recording, no reference to the pawn receipt, no acknowledgement of the 7 years I'd been erased without discussion. Just a quiet attempt to reset the rules without addressing how they'd been broken. My mother followed a day later. Her tone was softer, almost gentle. She asked how I was sleeping, whether I was eating enough, if work was stressful. Then halfway through the message, she pivoted. "Your wedding is coming up," she wrote. "It would mean a lot to us to be there. Us." I read that line several times, not because it hurt, but because it clarified something I'd been avoiding. They weren't asking for forgiveness. They were asking for continuity. For a version of the future that looked intact from the outside, regardless of what it required from me internally. I didn't reply. Julian noticed the shift before I did. The way my shoulders stayed relaxed when my phone buzzed. The way I stopped flinching at unexpected knocks on the door. One evening, he asked if I was okay with the silence. I said, surprised by how true it felt. "I'm just not interested in negotiating anymore." That was the word that kept returning to me: negotiation. For most of my life, love in my family had come with terms. Be patient. Be understanding. Don't escalate. Don't embarrass anyone. Absorb discomfort quietly so the structure stays intact. I had mistaken that for maturity. I saw now that it was compliance. Bianca tried one last time weeks later through an email that landed in my spam folder. She wrote about hardship, about therapy, about how being cut off had forced her to reflect. She said she missed me, that she hoped I could find it in myself to forgive her, because holding on to anger only hurts you. I deleted it without responding. Forgiveness wasn't the issue. Access was. The strangest part wasn't the grief, I'd done that already. It was the relief. The absence of constant calculation. I no longer had to anticipate reactions, adjust my tone, or preemptively soften truths to keep the peace. The emotional labor I'd been performing my entire life simply stopped. A week before the wedding, my parents sent a final message, this time through a family email thread that included extended relatives. The phrasing was careful, almost strategic. They expressed confusion about my distance. They said they hoped misunderstandings wouldn't prevent them from supporting me on an important day. It was the first time they'd tried to involve witnesses since the night Bianca exposed me. I replied once. "There is no misunderstanding," I wrote. "There is only accountability you're not willing to take." Then I left the thread. On the day of the wedding, I didn't feel anxious. I felt present. The ceremony was small, intentional. People there because they knew us, not because they shared our last names. When I walked down the aisle, I wasn't thinking about who wasn't in the room. I was thinking about who was. Afterward, Julian and I sat together at the reception, watching the evening unfold. At one point, he leaned over and said quietly, "Your family has nerve." I smiled. "They always have." "What happens if they show up?" he asked. They won't, I said. They need permission to cross boundaries. And I stopped giving it. We left that night without looking back, without scanning the crowd for familiar faces. There was no sense of loss waiting for me outside, only a steady certainty that I had chosen correctly. In the weeks that followed, life didn't transform into something extraordinary. It became ordinary in a way I'd never experienced before. Calm, predictable, free of emotional debt. I didn't wonder anymore if I'd been too harsh, or if time would soften things. Some bridges aren't meant to be repaired, not because forgiveness is impossible, but because returning would require pretending nothing happened. And I was done pretending. The story my family told about me no longer followed me. It had lost its audience. Whatever version of events they needed to survive without self-examination could continue without my participation. For the first time, my life wasn't shaped by reaction. It was shaped by choice. The last time I saw Bianca, it wasn't planned. There was no confrontation scheduled, no message warning me she was nearby. It happened in the most ordinary way at the end of a workday, when the light was already fading and my attention was on nothing more than getting home. I noticed her only because my car wouldn't move. At first, I thought something was wrong with the engine. Then I saw her reflection on the hood arms spread wide, palms flat against the metal, her body angled forward, as if sheer force of will could stop me from leaving. Traffic slowed behind us. Someone honked. The sound didn't register for a moment. I stepped out of the car slowly. "Get off," I said. My voice didn't shake. She turned her head just enough to look at me, her eyes red, unfocused. "If you drive away," she said, "I'll die. I swear I will." The words landed without impact. Not because they weren't serious, but because they were familiar. They weren't a cry for help. They were a demand. I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not fear, but a final clarity. This wasn't about reconciliation, it never had been. It was about control, and she was losing it. "Move," I said again. She didn't. I took out my phone and dialed. I explained the situation calmly. Where I was, what was happening, that someone was threatening self-harm and obstructing my vehicle. Bianca heard me and froze. "You can't do this," she said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "I'm your sister." "That's not a pass," I replied. When the police arrived, they approached her carefully, speaking in low, measured tones. She ignored them at first, still focused on me, still trying to pull me back into the role she needed me to play. When they asked her to step aside, she refused. When they tried again, she raised her voice, accusing me of cruelty, of abandonment, of destroying the family. They arrested her for harassment. I stood there as they led her away, her protests echoing into the street, and felt nothing but exhaustion. Not grief, not triumph. Just the quiet end of something that had been dragging itself forward long after it should have stopped. My parents bailed her out that night. The message from my father came first. "This was unnecessary," he wrote. "You went too far." My mother followed. "She's fragile," she said. "You should have handled it differently." I stared at the screen for a long time before typing my response. "No," I wrote. "I handled it the only way that didn't erase me. Then I blocked them. All of them." The silence afterward wasn't empty. It was stable. There were no loose ends pulling at me, no unfinished conversations replaying themselves at 3 a.m. I slept through the night for the first time in weeks, then months. Julian asked me once if I wanted to leave the door open. Just in case. I thought about that carefully. "I already left it open," I said. They walked through it every time and took something with them. That was the moment I understood the difference between boundaries and punishment. I wasn't cutting them off to hurt them. I was cutting them off because proximity had become a liability. Life moved on in small, unremarkable ways. Work deadlines, weekend routines, quiet dinners. The absence of chaos made space for things I hadn't realized I'd been missing: ease, consistency, the ability to exist without being evaluated. Every so often I wondered what story my parents told about me now. Whether Bianca had rewritten herself as the victim of an unforgiving sister. Whether my name still carried the weight of blame in rooms I no longer entered. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I no longer participated. Family, I learned, isn't defined by who you share blood with or where you come from. It's defined by who is willing to see you clearly and treat you like a person when it's inconvenient. It's defined by accountability, not loyalty demanded at any cost. Walking away didn't make me cold. Calling the police didn't make me cruel. Choosing myself didn't make me heartless. It made me free. And that freedom came with a simple truth. I wish I'd understood earlier. Family is not where you are born. It is where you are allowed to exist without being sacrificed. After everything that happened, I learned that survival doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like choosing not to answer the phone. Sometimes it looks like walking away without delivering a final speech. For a long time, I believed endurance was the same as love, that if I could tolerate enough, stay quiet enough, forgive fast enough, I would eventually earn my place. What I understand now is that love doesn't require you to disappear to keep it intact. And family, real family, doesn't ask you to carry blame so others can stay comfortable. Letting go didn't fix the past. It didn't give me back the years I spent questioning myself or wondering what I'd done wrong. But it did something quieter and more important: it stopped the damage from continuing. It gave me a life that isn't built around managing other people's emotions. It gave me peace that doesn't need to be defended. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? And if stories like this matter to you, stories about boundaries, truth, and choosing yourself, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe. Thank you for staying with me until the end.